The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune in the pediatric intensive care unit of St. Mary's Children's Hospital. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that felt like any other Tuesday in Marcus Chen's carefully constructed civilian life. He moved between the beds with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent the last 4 years learning every shadow, every corner, every sound that belonged in this place. His scrubs were navy blue, practical, clean. His badge read simply, Marcus Chen, RN, Night Shift. What the badge didn't say was that before he learned to check 4 lines and monitor ventilators, Marcus had learned to move through different kinds of darkness. Before he memorized medication dosages, he had memorized the weight of a loaded M4 carbine. Before he chose to save lives in a children's hospital, he had been trained to take them in the mountains of Afghanistan. The transformation hadn't been sudden. It had been deliberate, methodical, like everything Marcus did. When he returned from his 3rd deployment with the 75th Ranger Regiment, he found himself standing at a crossroads that many veterans know but few can articulate. On one side lay the familiar path, the adrenaline, the brotherhood, the clarity that comes from having a mission that matters. On the other side was something harder to define, a life where the battles were quieter but no less important, where victory was measured not in objectives secured but in small lives preserved. Marcus had chosen the harder path, and it had taken him 3 years to understand why. Room 314 held Sofia Martinez, 8 years old, recovering from her 2nd heart surgery. Her parents took shifts sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed, and Marcus had watched her father, Carlos, struggle with the helplessness that comes from being unable to fix what's broken in your child. Marcus understood that helplessness. He had felt it himself, in different circumstances, when the weight of responsibility met the limits of human capability. "Mr. Chen?" Sophia's voice was small in the dark room. She was awake, which wasn't unusual. The monitors and the unfamiliarity of the hospital made sleep elusive for many of the children. "Hey, Sophia. Can't sleep?" Marcus moved quietly to her bedside, his voice automatically shifting to the gentle tone he had learned worked best with frightened children. It was a different kind of voice than the one that had once given orders in combat zones, but it required the same intention, the same presence. "I had a bad dream," she whispered. Her dark eyes reflected the soft glow of the monitors. There were scary men with guns. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Children's fears often reflected adult anxieties they absorbed from the world around them, but sometimes they carried a weight that was harder to explain. "Dreams can be scary," he said, checking her monitors while keeping his voice steady. "But you're safe here. Do you want to tell me about it?" She shook her head quickly, then looked at him with the kind of directness that only children possess. "Are you strong enough to keep the scary men away?" Marcus paused in his charting. It was a simple question with a complicated answer. He looked at the small girl who had already endured more medical procedures than most adults, who faced each day with a courage that humbled him, and he made a choice about how much truth to share. "Sophia, I've learned that being strong isn't just about muscles or fighting. It's about not letting fear make your decisions for you. You're already stronger than you know. Look at everything you've been through, and you're still here, still brave enough to ask questions." He pulled up the chair that her father had vacated an hour earlier. "But, yes, if scary men ever came here, I would keep them away from you. That's a promise." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she nodded and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep. Marcus stayed for a moment longer, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, the reassuring beep of the heart monitor that confirmed what 2 surgeries had worked to restore. As he continued his rounds, Marcus reflected on the question that had shaped the last 4 years of his life: what did it mean to be strong? In the Rangers, strength had been clearly defined: physical endurance, mental toughness, the ability to complete the mission regardless of conditions. But civilian life had taught him that strength could be more subtle, more complex. The strength it took to hold the hand of a dying child while their parents fell apart. The strength required to remain calm when a teenager with cystic fibrosis asked if they were going to die. The strength needed to show up every night, even when the accumulation of other people's pain threatened to overwhelm his own carefully maintained equilibrium. Dr. Sarah Williams found him in the medication room at 3:30 a.m., preparing the next round of distributions. She was the attending physician for the unit, a woman in her mid-40s who had dedicated her career to pediatric intensive care. She was also one of the few people in the hospital who knew about Marcus's military background, though they had never discussed it directly. "How's the Martinez girl?" she asked, pulling up the patient files on the computer terminal. "Stable. Had some anxiety about nightmares, but she's sleeping now." Marcus continued preparing the medications, his movements precise and economical. "Vitals are all within normal ranges. The new medication seems to be helping with the arrhythmia." "Good." Sarah paused in her typing and looked at him. "Marcus, I want to ask you something, and feel free to tell me it's none of my business." He looked up from the medication cart. "What is it?" "I've been watching you work for 4 years. You're the most competent nurse I've ever worked with, but there's something else. The kids trust you in a way that's unusual. Their parents trust you. Even the other staff look to you when things get chaotic." She leaned against the counter, her expression thoughtful. "I'm wondering if you've ever considered going back to school, maybe pursuing a role with more leadership responsibility." Marcus finished labeling the last medication and closed the cart. It was a conversation he had been avoiding, not because he was afraid of additional responsibility, but because he was afraid of what that responsibility might reveal about his motivations for being here. "I appreciate that, Dr. Williams. I've thought about it, but I like what I do. I like being directly involved with patient care." "That's not an answer to my question," she said gently. "I'm not talking about administration. I'm talking about expanding your ability to help. You have instincts about crisis management that don't come from nursing school. You have a way of staying calm under pressure that's unusual. Those are gifts that could serve more people." Before Marcus could respond, the lights in the hallway flickered. Both of them looked up, waiting to see if the backup generators would kick in, but the lights stabilized. Through the large windows that looked out onto the hospital parking lot, Marcus could see that the street lights were also flickering. "Probably just a power fluctuation," Sarah said, but her tone had shifted slightly. "I should check with maintenance." Marcus nodded, but something had changed in the quality of his attention. It was a shift so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed it, but to someone trained to read environments for threat assessment, the hospital felt different. The flickering lights were one data point. The fact that it was now almost 4 a.m., the hour when security was most lax, when staff was most tired, when the hospital was most vulnerable, was another. He completed his medication rounds, but his route took him past the main elevator bank, past the stairwell entrances, past the security desk where Officer Reynolds was reading something on his phone. Marcus noted the locations of the emergency exits, the wait and swing direction of the fire doors, the sight lines from the nurse's station to each patient room. These were observations that came automatically, the product of training that was impossible to completely turn off. At 4:23 a.m., Marcus was in room 308 checking on Tommy Chen, no relation, despite sharing a last name, a 6-year-old recovering from surgery to repair a congenital defect in his intestines. Tommy's parents had gone home for the first time in 3 days, trusting the hospital staff to care for their son. Marcus was adjusting the boy's blankets when he heard something that made every instinct he possessed suddenly sharpen into focus. The elevator doors had opened, but there had been no electronic chime announcing an arrival. In the 4 years he had worked nights in this hospital, Marcus had learned that the elevators always chimed when they opened. Always. The absence of that familiar sound meant someone had overridden the system. Marcus moved to the doorway of room 308 and looked down the hallway toward the elevator bank. 3 figures emerged from the elevator shaft. They moved with the kind of deliberate quiet that came from training, and they were dressed in dark clothing that was too warm for the hospital's climate-controlled environment. The first figure was scanning the hallway with what Marcus recognized as tactical awareness. The second figure was carrying something in a way that suggested weight and concealment. The third figure was looking at what appeared to be a floor plan or schematic. Marcus stepped back into Tommy's room and reached for the call button that would alert the nurse's station, but before he could press it, the lights in the hallway went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, casting the unit in a red glow that transformed the familiar environment into something alien and threatening. Marcus heard Tommy stir in his bed, making a small sound of confusion and fear. Through the doorway, Marcus could see that the three figures had night vision equipment, and they were moving with the confidence of people who had planned for exactly this scenario. Marcus Chen, registered nurse, wanted to hit the call button and alert security, follow hospital protocol for emergency situations, and trust that the systems in place would handle whatever was happening. But Marcus Chen, former Army Ranger, recognized that those systems had already been compromised, that help was not coming soon enough, and that the children in this unit were depending on someone who could adapt to a situation that had moved beyond normal protocols. The man who had spent 3 years learning to destroy his weak self, the self that hesitated, that second-guessed, that needed permission to act, stepped forward to meet a threat that his stronger self had always known might eventually find him. Part 2. When training becomes instinct, the transformation was not dramatic. There was no moment of throwing off a disguise or revealing hidden weapons. Instead, Marcus Chen simply became more himself, the version of himself that had been shaped by 2 years of Ranger training and 3 combat deployments, the version that had learned to assess threats and respond to them with calculated precision. He moved Tommy deeper into the room, positioning the boy's bed behind the solid wall that would provide the best cover from the hallway. "Tommy, I need you to listen very carefully," he whispered, his voice calm but carrying an authority that the 6-year-old responded to immediately. "Some bad men are in the hospital, but I'm going to keep you safe. I need you to lie very still and stay quiet, no matter what you hear. Can you do that for me?" Tommy nodded, his eyes wide in the red glow of the emergency lighting. Marcus covered him with an extra blanket, both for comfort and to minimize his visibility, then moved to the doorway to assess the situation. The 3 intruders had split up. One remained near the elevator bank, apparently serving as a lookout and communications link. The other 2 were moving methodically through the unit, checking rooms. They weren't moving like people searching for something specific, they were moving like people preparing to control an area. Marcus counted their weapons, handguns visible on each figure, and what looked like additional equipment in the bags they carried. Marcus activated the emergency communication system on his phone, sending a silent alert that would reach hospital security, local police, and the FBI simultaneously. The alert included his location and a code that indicated an active threat with weapons. But, even with an immediate response, it would take law enforcement at least 8 minutes to reach the unit. The intruders had planned their timing well, the gap between awareness and response was exactly when the children in the unit would be most vulnerable. In room 312, he could see the silhouette of Elena Rodriguez, a 4-year-old recovering from surgery to repair a cleft palate. Her mother, Maria, was sleeping in the chair beside the bed. Room 314 held Sofia Martinez, whose earlier nightmare about scary men with guns now seemed less like childhood anxiety and more like premonition. Room 316 contained twins, born premature, whose parents had finally gone home to get some sleep after 6 weeks of maintaining a bedside vigil. Marcus moved through the unit with the kind of quiet efficiency that had once allowed him to navigate hostile terrain without detection. He reached room 312 first, moving to Maria Rodriguez's side and gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Maria," he whispered. "I'm Marcus, Elena's nurse. I need you to listen carefully and stay calm. There are dangerous people in the hospital, and I need you to take Elena and move to the supply closet at the end of the hall. Stay there until someone in a police uniform tells you it's safe to come out." Maria's eyes widened with immediate understanding. "Dios mío, what about I'll handle the other children? Take Elena now, quietly." Maria nodded and moved with the quick efficiency of a mother responding to a threat to her child. Marcus helped her disconnect Elena's monitoring equipment in a way that wouldn't trigger alarms, then watched as they moved quietly toward the supply closet. Room 314 required more complex logistics. Sophia was still connected to heart monitoring equipment that couldn't be easily disconnected, and her father Carlos had fallen asleep across her bed in a position that would make quick movement difficult. Marcus approached the bed and placed a gentle hand on Carlos's shoulder. Carlos woke instantly, his eyes immediately alert in the way of a parent accustomed to hospital emergencies. Marcus held a finger to his lips, then leaned close to Carlos's ear. "Carlos, there are armed men in the hospital. I need you to pick up Sophia and move her to the supply room at the end of the hall, behind the nurse's station. Move quietly and quickly. Carlos started to ask a question, but Marcus was already disconnecting Sophia's monitoring equipment with movements that were too quick and confident for a typical hospital emergency. Something in Marcus's demeanor, the way he moved, the quality of his attention, communicated to Carlos that this was not a drill or a misunderstanding. "What about you?" Carlos whispered as he lifted Sophia from the bed. "I'll be right behind you," Marcus said, which was true in the sense that he would ensure they reached safety, but incomplete in terms of what he planned to do next. Room 316 presented the most complex challenge. The twins, David and Daniel Kim, were both connected to ventilators and monitoring equipment that couldn't be moved quickly. They were also too small and too medically fragile to be relocated without significant risk. Marcus made the decision that would have to live with regardless of how the night ended. The twins would have to remain in their room, which meant the threat would have to be eliminated before it reached them. Marcus moved to the nurse's station and quickly accessed the hospital's internal communication system. He sent a message to Dr. Williams, who he knew was still in the building, alerting her to move all available staff to the secure areas on the lower floors. He also activated the lockdown protocol for the unit, which would seal the fire doors and limit the intruders' access to other parts of the hospital. By now, the two intruders who had been checking rooms were moving more quickly, apparently aware that their presence had been detected. The one near the elevator bank was speaking into a radio or phone, likely coordinating with additional team members who might be positioned elsewhere in the hospital. Marcus returned to room 308 where Tommy Chen remained hidden under his blankets. "Tommy, I need you to move to the bathroom and lock the door. Stay there until I come get you, okay? Are you going to fight the bad men?" Tommy asked, his voice small but curious rather than afraid. Marcus paused. It was a simple question that cut to the heart of what he was about to do. "Yes," he said. "That's what I'm trained for." Tommy nodded as if this made perfect sense, then moved quickly to the bathroom. Marcus heard the lock click into place. Now Marcus was alone in the hallway with three armed intruders whose purpose was still unclear but whose presence represented an immediate threat to 12 children and the staff responsible for their care. The tactical situation was not favorable. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in an environment with limited cover and multiple potential casualties. But he also had advantages that the intruders didn't know about: complete familiarity with the terrain, knowledge of where the children were hidden, and training that had been designed to overcome exactly these kinds of odds. Marcus moved to the medication room and retrieved a scalpel from the surgical supplies. It was not an ideal weapon, but it was sharp, quiet, and familiar in his hands. He also grabbed a heavy flashlight from the emergency supplies and clipped his hospital badge to his shirt in a position where it would be clearly visible. If law enforcement arrived while he was dealing with the threat, he wanted them to immediately identify him as hospital staff. The first intruder had separated from the group and was moving toward the supply closet where Maria Rodriguez and Elena were hidden. Marcus intercepted him in the hallway outside room 320, using the kind of approach that would have been recognizable to anyone with military training but would look like chaos to a civilian observer. The encounter was brief, quiet, and decisive. Marcus used the scalpel to disable the intruder's weapon hand, then used the flashlight to render him unconscious. The entire interaction took less than 30 seconds and resulted in no noise that would alert the other intruders to what had happened. Marcus dragged the unconscious intruder into room 320, which was currently unoccupied, and zip-tied his hands with restraints from the medical supplies. He retrieved the intruder's weapon, a Glock 19 with an extended magazine, and checked his pockets for additional equipment. He found a radio, night vision goggles, and what appeared to be a floor plan of the hospital marked with specific locations. The radio crackled with a voice speaking in what sounded like a mixture of English and another language Marcus didn't immediately recognize. The tone was questioning, probably the other intruders wondering why their teammate wasn't responding to check-ins. Marcus clipped the radio to his belt and continued moving through the unit. The second intruder was checking the rooms where children had been relocated, apparently confused by finding them empty. Marcus found him in room 314, standing over Sophia's empty bed with what appeared to be growing frustration. This encounter required more complex tactics because the intruder was in a position where a struggle might be overheard by the lookout near the elevator bank. Marcus waited until the intruder moved away from the bed, then used an approach that combined his nursing knowledge of human anatomy with his military training in close-quarters combat. The intruder was unconscious and restrained within 45 seconds. Marcus retrieved his weapon and equipment, noting that the radio traffic was becoming more urgent and frequent. The third intruder, the one serving as lookout, had apparently decided that the lack of communication from his teammates indicated a problem. Marcus could hear him moving away from the elevator bank, probably to investigate what had happened to the others. Marcus positioned himself in the nurse's station, which provided good sight lines down the hallway and good cover from the equipment and furniture. He had the advantage of knowing the intruder's approximate location and movement pattern, while the intruder was operating with incomplete information about what had happened to his teammates. The encounter, when it came, was different from the first two. The third intruder was more experienced, more alert, and better trained. When he realized that his teammates had been eliminated, he immediately shifted into a defensive posture and tried to establish radio contact with what were apparently additional team members outside the hospital. Marcus heard the radio response, "Package secure, exfil in 3 minutes." The transmission told Marcus several important things. First, this was a coordinated operation with multiple teams. Second, the primary objective, whatever package referred to, had been completed. Third, the team had an extraction plan that was about to be executed. But it also told Marcus something else: the immediate threat to the children in the pediatric unit was ending, but the larger threat to the hospital was not. Whatever these people had come to accomplish, they had apparently succeeded, and they were preparing to leave. Marcus made a decision that would define how this night ended. He could remain in the unit, maintain security for the children under his care, and wait for law enforcement to arrive. It was the safe choice, the choice that prioritized the children he was directly responsible for protecting. Or he could pursue the retreating intruders and try to determine what they had accomplished, potentially preventing a larger catastrophe but leaving the children temporarily unprotected. The decision was made easier by the sound of police sirens in the distance, growing closer. Law enforcement was minutes away from the unit, which meant the children would soon be under official protection. But the intruders' extraction plan was also minutes away from completion, which meant whatever they had done might be permanent unless someone intervened immediately. Marcus secured the third intruder using the same methods he had applied to the first two, then retrieved all of their equipment and weapons. He moved quickly to the supply closet and informed Maria Rodriguez and Elena that law enforcement was arriving and they should remain hidden until officers in uniform told them it was safe to emerge. He checked on the other children, Sofia and Carlos in the supply room, Tommy in the bathroom, the twins in their room connected to their ventilators. All were safe, all were accounted for, all would be secure once law enforcement established control of the unit. Marcus clipped his hospital badge prominently to his shirt, ensured that the weapons he had retrieved were clearly visible as confiscated evidence, and prepared to brief the responding officers on what had happened and what they needed to know about the children's locations and medical needs. But, as he heard the footsteps of law enforcement officers in the stairwell, Marcus also heard something else, the sound of a helicopter approaching the hospital roof. Part 3, the weight of choices made the first law enforcement officers to reach the pediatric unit moved with the practiced efficiency of a tactical response team. Marcus met them at the stairwell entrance with his hands visible and his hospital badge clearly displayed. The team leader, a sergeant whose name tag read Morrison, immediately assessed Marcus as either a threat or an asset. "I'm Marcus Chen, registered nurse for this unit," Marcus said, his voice calm and professional. "I have 3 suspects detained and secured. All children and families in the unit are accounted for and safe. I have confiscated weapons and equipment that need to be processed as evidence." Sergeant Morrison studied Marcus for a moment, taking in the confiscated weapons, the systematic way the intruders had been restrained, and the calm competence with which Marcus was handling the situation. "Mr. Chen, I need you to understand that until we verify your story, you're also a person of interest. Are you willing to cooperate fully with our investigation?" "Absolutely," Marcus replied. "But I need you to know that these 3 were part of a larger operation. I heard radio traffic indicating that their primary objective was completed and that an extraction is scheduled. There's a helicopter approaching the roof right now. Morrison immediately activated his radio, communicating with the command post that had been established in the hospital parking lot. Within seconds, Marcus could hear additional units being dispatched to secure the roof and prevent any aerial extraction. Mr. Chen, I'm going to have Officer Davis stay with you while we secure the scene and verify the children's safety. I need you to walk us through exactly what happened, in detail. Marcus provided a concise but complete account of the evening's events, from the first signs that something was wrong to the systematic neutralization of the three intruders. As he spoke, other officers moved through the unit, locating the hidden children and families and beginning the process of ensuring their safety and medical care. Dr. Sarah Williams arrived as Marcus was completing his briefing. She had been in the cardiac wing when the lockdown alert was activated, and she immediately began checking on each of the children to ensure that their medical needs had been maintained throughout the incident. Marcus, she said, after confirming that all the children were stable and unharmed, what you did tonight was my job, Marcus replied quietly. The job was protecting the children. Everything else was just tactics. But, even as he said it, Marcus knew that wasn't entirely true. The job of a registered nurse was to provide medical care and ensure patient safety within the established protocols of a healthcare facility. What he had done was something different. It was the application of military training to a civilian crisis, the use of skills that were designed for warfare and the protection of children. The question that would stay with him was whether the transformation had been necessary or whether it had been the only response he knew how to make. As the investigation unfolded over the next several hours, the picture that emerged was both more complex and more disturbing than anyone had initially understood. The three intruders who had targeted the pediatric unit were not the primary objective of the operation. They were a diversion, designed to draw law enforcement attention to the children's hospital while the real operation took place elsewhere in the medical complex. The actual target had been the research laboratory on the 7th floor, where a team of specialists had been working on experimental treatments for pediatric cancer. The attackers had successfully stolen research data, experimental medications, and equipment worth millions of dollars. More importantly, they had also taken detailed files on children who were participating in experimental treatment protocols, including home addresses, family information, and medical histories. The helicopter that Marcus had heard approaching the roof had successfully extracted the primary team along with the stolen materials. By the time law enforcement reached the roof, the aircraft was already beyond the range of immediate pursuit. Marcus learned these details during his debriefing with FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who had taken over the investigation once it became clear that this was a coordinated attack on a federal research facility. Agent Walsh was particularly interested in Marcus's military background and his assessment of the tactical capabilities demonstrated by the intruders. Mr. Chen, based on your observations, how would you assess the training level of the individuals you encountered? Marcus considered the question carefully. The first two were competent but not exceptional. They moved well, they had good equipment, but they made mistakes that suggested they weren't accustomed to operating in this kind of environment. The third individual was more experienced. Better situational awareness, better tactical discipline. And your assessment of the overall operation? Professional. Well planned. Multiple contingencies. Good intelligence about hospital security protocols and staff patterns. Marcus paused. The timing was precise. They knew exactly when the unit would be most vulnerable, when security would be lightest, when response time would be longest. Agent Walsh nodded, making notes on her tablet. Mr. Chen, I want to be direct with you. What you did tonight likely saved lives, but it also raises some questions. You engaged 3 armed intruders using methods that go well beyond standard civilian response protocols. Were you concerned about the legal implications of your actions? It was a question Marcus had been expecting, and one he had been thinking about since the first police officers arrived. Agent Walsh, I made decisions based on immediate threat assessment and available options. I used the minimum force necessary to neutralize threats to the children under my care. I'm confident that any review will show that my actions were proportionate to the threat level. That's not what I'm asking, Agent Walsh replied. I'm asking whether you considered the legal risk to yourself before you decided to engage armed intruders instead of hiding and waiting for law enforcement. Marcus looked at her directly. Agent Walsh, there were 12 children in that unit who couldn't protect themselves and couldn't be relocated safely. When someone threatens children who can't defend themselves, the legal risk to me becomes irrelevant. Agent Walsh studied him for a moment. Mr. Chen, would you be willing to undergo additional debriefing with some specialists who consult with us on matters involving individuals with military backgrounds transitioning to civilian professions? Are you asking whether I have PTSD or whether tonight's events indicate that I'm having difficulty separating my military training from my civilian responsibilities? Those are certainly among the questions that need to be explored. Marcus nodded. I'm willing to participate in any evaluation you think is necessary. But, I want to be clear about something. Tonight wasn't about difficulty separating my military background from my civilian job. Tonight was about using whatever skills I have to protect children who were in danger. If that requires additional evaluation, I understand, but I won't apologize for it. The debriefing continued for several more hours, covering every detail of the incident and exploring Marcus's decision-making process throughout the encounter. As the sun began to rise over the hospital complex, Marcus was finally cleared to return to the pediatric unit to complete his shift. He found that the unit had been returned to normal operations, with additional security presence and modified protocols that would remain in place until the investigation was completed. The children who had been moved during the incident had been returned to their rooms, and their medical care had resumed without significant interruption. Marcus began his rounds, checking on each child and family to ensure that they were recovering well from the trauma of the night's events. In room 308, he found Tommy Chin awake and alert, with his parents at his bedside. Mr. Chen, Tommy's mother said as Marcus entered the room, Tommy told us what happened. We want to thank you. Tommy was very brave, Marcus replied. He followed instructions perfectly and kept himself safe. Mommy, Tommy said, Mr. Chun fought the bad men. He has special training. Tommy's father looked at Marcus with an expression of curiosity mixed with gratitude. Special training? Marcus checked Tommy's monitors and adjusted his medication schedule. I served in the military before I became a nurse. Sometimes old training is useful in new situations. In room 312, he found Elena Rodriguez sleeping peacefully with her mother maintaining a vigilant watch from the bedside chair. Maria Rodriguez looked up as Marcus entered. Mr. Chen, what you did for Elena, for all of us, how do we thank someone for something like that? Marcus checked Elena's surgical site and noted that her recovery was progressing well. Mrs. Rodriguez, the best thanks is seeing Elena get better and go home healthy. In room 314, he found Sofia Martinez awakened, drawing in a coloring book while her father dozed in the chair beside her bed. She looked up as Marcus approached. Mr. Chen, you kept your promise, she said. You kept the scary men away. Marcus sat down beside her bed. Sophia, do you remember what we talked about before? About being strong? She nodded. What happened last night was scary, but you and your daddy and all the other children stayed safe because everyone worked together. The doctors and nurses and police officers and your families, everyone did their job to keep you protected. That's what real strength looks like. Sophia considered this, then looked at him with the kind of directness that only children possess. Are you going to keep being my nurse? It was a question that Marcus hadn't fully considered until that moment. The events of the night had demonstrated that his military training was still very much a part of who he was, that the skills he had learned in combat could be applied to the protection of civilian lives in ways he hadn't anticipated. But, they had also raised questions about whether his presence in a healthcare facility represented a risk to patients, to colleagues, to the institution itself. Sophia, I'm going to keep taking care of sick children for as long as they'll let me. That's what I want to do. Good, she said, returning to her coloring book. I feel safer when you're here. As Marcus completed his rounds and prepared to end his shift, he reflected on the question that Dr. Williams had asked him earlier in the week, whether he had considered taking on additional leadership responsibility in the hospital. At the time, he had avoided the question because he wasn't sure what his motivations were for choosing nursing as a career. Now he understood that the question was more complex than he had realized. Leadership in a hospital wasn't just about administrative responsibility or advanced medical training. It was about the willingness to make difficult decisions under pressure, to take responsibility for outcomes beyond your direct control, to use whatever skills and experience you possessed in service of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The events of the night had demonstrated that Marcus's military training would always be part of who he was as a nurse. The question was whether that integration could be purposeful rather than reactive, whether it could be channeled into leadership that served the mission of healing rather than just the tactics of protection. As he changed out of his scrubs at the end of his shift, Marcus thought about the phrase that had shaped his thinking for the past 4 years: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. He had interpreted that as meaning he needed to eliminate the parts of himself that were shaped by military training in order to become effective as a civilian healthcare provider. But the events of the night had taught him something different. Strength wasn't about destroying parts of yourself, it was about integrating all parts of yourself in service of something larger than your own comfort or convenience. His military training hadn't been an obstacle to overcome in his civilian career, it had been a resource to be channeled appropriately. The weak self that needed to be destroyed wasn't the soldier or the nurse, it was the version of himself that tried to compartmentalize these identities instead of allowing them to inform and strengthen each other. Marcus walked out of the hospital into the morning sunlight, knowing that he would return for his next shift with a different understanding of what it meant to be a protector in a place of healing. The children in the pediatric unit needed nurses who could provide expert medical care, but they also needed advocates who would use whatever skills they possessed to ensure that places of healing remained safe spaces. The investigation would continue for weeks, and the implications of the research theft would unfold over months. But the children would continue to need care, and Marcus would continue to provide it, with the understanding that sometimes the most important nursing skill is the willingness to stand between patients and whatever threatens their safety. The man who destroys his weak self, the self that hesitates, that compartmentalizes, that refuses to use all available resources in service of those who need protection, that man becomes someone who cannot be destroyed by others because he has integrated his entire identity in service of something that matters more than his own survival. Marcus Chen had spent 4 years learning to be a nurse. In one night, he had learned what it meant to be both a nurse and a protector, and he had discovered that these identities were not contradictory but complementary. The children were safe. The mission continued. And Marcus finally understood what strength looked like when it was applied not to the destruction of enemies but to the protection of the innocent. As he drove home through the morning traffic, Marcus made a decision that would define the next phase of his career. When Dr. Williams asked again about additional leadership responsibilities, he would say yes. Not because he wanted authority or advancement, but because leadership in healthcare meant taking responsibility for ensuring that places of healing remained safe for the people who needed them most. The weak self that needed to be destroyed was the self that believed protection and healing were separate missions. The strong self that could never be destroyed was the one that understood they were the same mission, requiring different tactics but the same fundamental commitment to preserving life and preventing harm. Marcus Chen, registered nurse and former Army Ranger, would continue to serve in the pediatric intensive care unit, but with a broader understanding of what service meant in a world where threats to the innocent could come from any direction. The children would be safe, not just because of hospital security protocols or law enforcement response times, but because the people caring for them were prepared to use whatever skills they possessed to ensure that healing could happen in safety. The night had ended. The mission continued. And, for the first time since returning from military service, Marcus understood that he hadn't needed to choose between being a soldier and being a healer. He had needed to become someone who could be both, when circumstances required it. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has learned that true strength comes not from what you're willing to fight against, but from what you're willing to fight for.